my sense is that we know that the base rate of psychopathy across cultures is about 4%, which isn't that high. But we also know that there were historical epochs in which the cluster B personality types probably got the upper hand. And I would suspect that happened in the French Revolution. I think it probably happened in the Russian Revolution, probably happened during the rise of the Nazis in National Socialist Germany. You don't need that many people to be disinhibited in their psychopathology before your culture might be in grave danger. And that's particularly true if they can organize, which they can really do online. And so I'm very concerned that the incentive structure online facilitates dark tetrad behavior. Now, there's more evidence too, right? Because here's another problem. 25% or thereabouts of online content is pornographic. So basically criminal, right? It's basically prostitution facilitated by electronic pimps. So that's not good. And then a tremendous amount of online activity is outright criminal, right? I mean, older people are just being scammed on an unbelievably constant basis. And so it might be that 50% of online activity is in the psychopathic, antisocial, and cluster B realm. It's very, very difficult to regulate. And my suspicions are is that spilling over in a really counterproductive manner into the actual flesh and blood world. And so, you know, I'm curious about your thoughts about that, because one of the things that's odd about you on Twitter, in a good way, is that you are constantly drawing people's attention to the relationship between cluster B psychopathology and online and political behavior. And so what do you think about that as a hypothesis with regard to the pathological incentive structure of the virtual world, right? Maybe it's a non-playable, degenerating game. Like it could be.
Well, I think in a lot of ways, that's exactly why, and I know you're familiar with the paper that I wrote on this, is social media is an incubator of all of this cluster B type of stuff, because on social media, you have this indirect, communicative, language-based amplification of all of these traits, whereas male aggression in the real world, it doesn't scale. You have an encounter, there's something said, somebody gets, punched in the face, and that's it. What you have is on social media, indirect aggression, and you have all of these traits and antagonism and histrionic, behavior that just basically gets amplified and emotionally resonates and resonates and resonates and balloons out. And it builds and builds and builds. And, one of the best examples of that is what we saw with Hamas. I mean, they filmed all their atrocities as they were going into Israel. And that was one of the most, interesting in a morbid way kind of aspects of that incursion. Was it was just filmed. They were basically, in fact, doing it for the lulz, regardless of whether you think on how much atrocities or what was the exact specific atrocities that were committed. They were filming them on GoPro for exactly that reason, and to amplify that. And so, that is one way, for a perfect example of how this is all spiraled out of control. And I will say for myself, others have written about the cluster B stuff in terms of political ideology and how that's played out before. The famous Loboszewski is one of them, and others. So, but I just see it so clearly, because when you look at the traits and you look at what's happening online, it's a perfect incubator for all of these just to continue to amplify and amplify and amplify without any mechanism that limits it, and it just spills out. And then what happens is you have an event like October 7th, or you have an event like what you're seeing on these campus tent cities. All of that's mediated and amplified online, and then it gets played out with all this petulance and romper room behavior on campuses.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dig into that two ways. So the thing I'd like to point out, and you can comment on this if you would, is that you mentioned that male aggression doesn't scale well, and it doesn't work that well in the real world. And that's definitely the case. I mean, one of the things that my daughter was often perplexed about when she was growing up in our household with our brother is the difference in response pattern to aggression between boys and between girls. So my son and his teenage friends would not that infrequently have an altercation. You know, sometimes it might even come to brief blows, and that would end it. And that would often not only not stop a friendship, but strengthen it, partly because they knew where they stood with each other. Now, this didn't happen that often, but the threat of it happening was always there. Now, with the girls, by contrast, they could backbite and gossip and screech and moan and bitch and kill each other virtually online, and there was no limit to it. And it was very difficult to limit at all. It's definitely the case that female-style antisocial behavior is unbelievably difficult to regulate. Now, having said that, I'm not blaming the females for online pathological behavior, although there's certainly the female equivalent of that in places like TikTok. But what I do see happening is that the histrionic, narcissistic, and borderline, the men who have those traits can get away with that kind of female-type antisocial behavior online, that gossiping and backbiting and reputation savaging and, you know, outright Machiavellian deception with absolutely no consequences, or even worse, with a certain level of perverse reward because attention is brought to it and maybe even amplified by the social media companies. So that's not good, to say the least. Now, let's add one more thing to that people need to understand. So, you know, the conflict between Hamas, let's say, and the people of Israel and the rest of the bloody world, for that matter, can be construed as a political or as a religious or economic battle. But you put your finger on something that's absolutely vital. So the cluster B types, the psychopaths and the narcissists and the Machiavellians, they're unbelievably good at using proclamations of victimization to justify their aggression, and also to camouflage what they're doing with a moral story. And so, like, when I think of violent religious fundamentalists, I don't actually generally think of the religion itself as a motivation, even though it can be. I think of the psychopathic, power-striving, narcissistic Machiavellian adopting the cloak of the religious. That's what the Pharisees do in the Gospels, by the way, and they're Christ's biggest enemy. They adopt the camouflage of moral virtue, religious, economic, or social, and then they pretend to be the good guys, while in fact they're ravening, what did Christ call them? The ravening graves that would devour even the ancestors that they claim to worship. And so I think that as a culture, we're radically underestimating the perverse consequences of the intermingling of the cluster B psychopathologies with the hypothetically religious, political, and economic, right? We're making them primary when in fact the pathology, the cluster B pathology, is probably the primary problem. So maybe when you see people involved in sectarian violence, the first thing you should ask yourself is, well, is that sectarian violence, or is that just an excuse for the Cain-like narcissists to get the upper hand? So what do you think about that?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I see the world from that lens of looking at psychopathology as opposed to the background religion itself. You know, clearly there's definitely historical religious conflicts that motivate some of this, but I see it much more from the perspective of how does this culture give rise to these macro-social, what I consider contagions of these cluster B traits. And you mentioned lying and moral virtue. And I think one of the things, and I just made this point a couple of days ago with regards to what's happening here in the States and sort of the lies that the mainstream media have told about Joe Biden, is that there's lying that most corrupt politicians will do. Many people lie. There's white lies and so forth. And then there's lying, but moralizing that lie. And moralizing that lie, in my view, is much more worse and psychopathic than just some lie that you beat some kid on the street the other day and it never happened. And you see that's the strategy that they use. They lie, but they moralize it. They're the oppressed. They're the victims. So that gives them the currency to then create and engage in all sorts of atrocities or behaviors that somehow are socially acceptable. And you mentioned too the sort of male instantiation of these cluster B traits, and that's something that I saw during COVID online too. A lot of the female scholars that I was collaborating with at one point, or that kind of grew to know, who were doing COVID work or pushing for the elimination of mask mandates or saying that lockdowns were harmful, they were getting attacked by these male narcissistic, what I would consider trolls on Twitter, who had credentialed degrees, but they were constantly bullying these female nurses, doctors, and so forth in the most trollish way. And so that sort of manifestation was something that was very glaring. That would have never played out in the real world. It was only made possible by the sort of milieu of the social environment of the internet and social media.